Second of all, understanding the rules of relationships. There are certain principles and keys that every relationship has, and you've got to understand what those keys are. And then really being able to apply them, and when you apply them well, you do what I call raising your relational IQ. Relationships are an art form, and a lot of people don't have the skill that they need to really be able to navigate through all of the relationships of life the correct way. And so people know their intelligence quotient. There's something called your relational IQ as well, that you've got to understand what it is and be able to raise it so that you can do relationships well.
Why do you think this is so important for a Christian?
Well, I think number one, because everything in the world revolves around relationships. I think number two, because God is the author of relationships. It was very interesting. I was listening into Christine Cane's session, and she referenced something that's one of my favorite scriptures. When Jesus is asked of all of the law of Moses, which ones are the most important? And he says you can take everything that Moses taught, the 10 Commandments, and how they were subdivided into 619 or 13 laws. You can sum it up into two things. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as you love yourself. And so Jesus, in effect, takes all of the prophets and all of the law and sums it up into two important relationships. The relationship you have with the Lord and a relationship that you have with others. And I think that's really the heart and the crux of really the church and Christianity. I think, unfortunately, historically, we haven't done that well. I think we only focused on one aspect, which is loving the Lord, but we haven't allowed that to infuse and infect how we do relationships with other people. So I think this message of hope and encouragement and how to do relationships better has to start in the church. I think that is the greatest desire that God has in this generation. I think if we as the church begin to love people the right way and handle them the right way, I think we can change the world.
Lastly, why do you think a conference like this is so important?
Well, I think you can't think any bigger or any higher than what you're exposed to. And so it's important that we come together. And it's also important that you rub elbows with some of the best and the brightest, because there's power, number one, in agreement, but then in atmosphere. You know, when you get in an environment like this where you are given the skills and the strategies and just imparted to, you change. And as you change, we begin to change everybody that we're connected to. And it then really does become more of a movement. And that's what Woman Unleashed is. It's not just a conference, it's a movement. There's a catalyst that starts here, but then it continues on all really around the world. So that's why these kinds of meetings are extremely important. The very first person you want to fall in love with is the Lord. If you can't love the Lord, you will never be able to effectively love anybody else. And so this is, for single people, the greatest time of your life that you'll never get back. And you know what's so funny? Every single person, when they get married, that I know, that I have in 22 years, met with and talked to and has read my book, you know what they always say? Man, if I had time, I wish I could go back and redo some things in my single life. I know single people that are rushing to get married, then they get married and wish that they would have taken advantage more of their singleness. There are married people that rushed into marriage and they say the same thing. Wow, if I could have gone back in time, I'd take a little bit more time and I'd do some things to get me ready, to focus on some things in me. And so when I say to every single person is take advantage of this season. You are in this season for a reason. There is a purpose to your singleness. Find out exactly what it is. Fall in love with the Lord. Be everything that He's called you to be individually, and then that will make your union with whoever your Boaz is much, much better.
Healthy relationships with unhealthy people. Elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, there's an adage that says that we can choose our family. Well, let me say it another way. We can't choose our family, but we can choose our friends. Unfortunately, a lot of times you don't have that option. You don't have that ability to choose a relationship, particularly in the workplace. And so what often happens is that you are forced to learn how to do relationships with difficult people. And it's a challenge, but it's a challenge that everybody faces. So one of the most important things that I deal with in my book, The People Factor, is how do we do that? And one of the ways that you have to understand that will allow you to do that the right way is by setting up boundaries. You know, boundaries have to be established in order for you to remain healthy and still deal with toxic people. Sometimes we can't avoid toxic people. Sometimes, even in our family, we have toxic people. And so the only way to limit their toxicity and to really put them at bay and to not allow that toxic nature or their negativity to really control your life is to understand how to set up boundaries and to live those boundaries out. And what I found is that a lot of people, number one, don't understand the importance of boundaries, or they don't know how to set them and enforce them. And what ends up happening is they allow toxic people and negativity negative people, just crazy folk in the workplace to spill all over into their lives, and they end up being negatively impacted by it. And so that's really important. Well, one of the things that the body of Christ has to do is we have to take a stand for Christ, not just what Christ says. Meaning that the greatest testimony that we can have to the world is how we love one another and what we do on a consistent basis. The Mike Brown situation and everything that's happened in Ferguson and around the world, those things are just ridiculous. But the world has been crying out prior to this incident for us to take a stand, and the world will continue to cry out. The world is hurting. This is why the church needs to step up. And the way that we do it, as I talked about earlier, is not just living in the church, but literally being the church in the world. Being salt, being light, not just compartmentalizing our faith to a Sunday morning experience, but living it out. There are hurting people all around the world. Some of us work with hurting people, and we walk by them and won't say anything to them. And what God demands is for us to literally be His ambassadors. He says this in the Word. Paul says it this way in Corinthians, that we are therefore Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making His appeal to us. That's a very, very powerful statement that the body of Christ, I don't think, is fully embraced. That's what we need to do on a consistent basis. And when the world sees that, when we're carrying that level of glory in the workplace, in the marketplace, and everywhere we go, then we can prevent some of the Ferguson kind of things from happening on a consistent basis.